Celara, the alien princess from the powerful and sophisticated Silivian race, had always lived her life surrounded by strict rules and high expectations. Her people were conquerors, traveling across galaxies and claiming worlds with precision. Their ways were orderly, and everything, from their diet to their social customs, was calculated for efficiency and survival. Emotions were a luxury, something that could cloud judgment. Her education had been rigorous, her thoughts trained to see her species as superior to others, especially the humans. Humans, as far as Celara had been taught, were primitive. They had no advanced technologies, no powerful empires. They were known for their frail bodies and chaotic societies. Her teachers often spoke of them in dismissive tones, emphasizing their lack of discipline and refinement. And when it came to food, her tutors had made it clear, the human diet was nothing but a distraction. Their eating habits were unorganized and unrefined, unlike the nutrient-dense sustenance her people relied on. But Celara had always been different from the other Silivians. While her people followed their set path, she was curious. She would often sneak away from her duties, wandering through the gardens and looking out across the human colonies they visited, wondering what it was like to be one of them. She would hear whispers of human customs, their odd practices, and something about them fascinated her. There was one thing in particular that piqued her interest the most: their food. It wasn't just about eating to survive. Humans seemed to enjoy food, to savor it. There were no bland meals designed for maximum nutrition, no careful balancing of proteins, vitamins, and minerals. Instead, humans were obsessed with flavors, spices, sauces, textures. And it wasn't just the act of eating, but the joy they seemed to find in it. Celara could see it in their eyes as they laughed together while sharing meals. The way they passed food to one another, how they savored each bite, how food was part of their social interactions. It was all so foreign to her, but it was also intriguing. One evening, while observing from a distance, she watched a human group seated around a fire, sharing what appeared to be simple bread and a thick soup. Yet the way they spoke about the meal, the smiles they shared, made Celara feel something deep inside. She didn't fully understand it, but there was warmth there, something she had never known among her own people. Silivians did not eat for pleasure. They ate for function, for survival. The idea of food being something more than sustenance, something that could bring people together, was new to her. For days, she pondered the idea. Her curiosity only deepened. She could not get the image of the humans enjoying their meal out of her mind. It felt so alive. Yet, at the same time, she knew it was a forbidden curiosity. To taste human food, to indulge in something so simple, would be seen as an act of weakness among her people. It would be a betrayal of the rigid discipline and control they held dear. Despite the rules, despite the warnings, Celara couldn't help herself. She needed to know what it felt like. She had to experience it, even if it meant defying the expectations of her own race. After all, she was a princess. She could command anything, but her heart longed for something more than just power and order. It longed for discovery. She had tasted nothing like it before, but she could feel the tug of the unknown, pulling her toward a new kind of truth, something that might exist outside of the cold, calculated existence she had always known. One night, when the stars were especially bright, Celara made up her mind. She would taste human food. She didn't know how or when it would happen, but she was determined. The idea of it excited her, yet also made her nervous. What if it wasn't as she imagined? What if it was just a fleeting, unsatisfying experience? Still, the curiosity was too strong to ignore. Celara slipped away from her chambers and into the quiet corridors of the human settlement. She moved silently, avoiding the watchful eyes of her guards and aides, who were all accustomed to the perfect discipline of Silivian life. No one suspected the princess would venture out into such a mundane human environment. But Celara was careful. She had planned every step, determined to keep her secret safe. As she wandered deeper into the settlement, the smells began to overpower her. The air was filled with an aromatic mix of spices, herbs, and fresh-baked bread. Her senses, which had been trained to only detect efficiency and order, were now bombarded with unfamiliar, pleasing scents. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, something that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't experienced before. In the heart of the settlement, she found a small street market. Humans of all shapes and sizes were bargaining, laughing, and sharing food. The sight was both alien and inviting. Solara hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, she approached a food stall where a human vendor was grilling something on a skewer. The vendor caught her eye, and without hesitation, he offered her a taste. She could see the kindness in his eyes, the open trust that was so rare in her own people. "Would you like to try?" the human man asked with a smile. Solara, for the first time in her life, felt a strange flutter in her chest. Without thinking, she nodded. The human handed her the skewer, and she took it in her hand. The warm food seemed to radiate with a strange energy, as if it held within it the stories of the people who had made it. She lifted it to her lips, her heart pounding in anticipation. As the first bite touched her tongue, Solara was overwhelmed by a rush of sensations. The flavor was bold, spicy, sweet, and savory all at once. It wasn't just food, it was an experience. The textures, the heat, the mingling of spices, everything was unlike anything she had ever tasted. It was as if the universe had opened up for a brief moment and allowed her to see, feel, and taste the richness of life in its simplest form. For the first time, Solara felt something stir inside her, something beyond the power and control her people valued so highly. It was a feeling of warmth, of connection, of life. She couldn't believe it. The human food was beautiful. Solara's heart raced as she stood there, holding the skewer of human food in her hand. The warm, savory flavors were still tingling on her tongue, and the strange feeling of excitement lingered in her chest. She looked down at the small, simple food in her hand. To humans, this might have been an ordinary meal, but to Solara, it was a discovery, something her people could never understand. She could taste the love and care that went into making this food, something so unlike the cold, efficient meals back in her ship's sterile kitchens. For a moment, Solara stood frozen, lost in the moment. Then, as the crowd around her went on with their busy lives, she snapped back to reality. She realized what she had just done. She had tasted the food of humans. It wasn't just food, though. It was an experience. She could feel it in every bite, in the way it brought warmth to her body and mind. She could feel it all the way down to her soul. But she had to leave before anyone noticed her, before anyone found out that she had broken the unspoken rule. The secrecy of the moment made it all the more thrilling. She moved quickly, slipping away from the bustling market, her mind buzzing with thoughts. She knew it was dangerous to let herself be caught up in something so simple, so human, but the feeling was addictive. Solara wasn't sure what she had been searching for, but she knew this was only the beginning. As she walked through the quiet streets, her thoughts spun in all directions. She had been taught to believe that humans were inferior, that their food was nothing more than a distraction from the true purpose of life. But in this small, stolen moment, everything she had been told seemed wrong. What was it about human food that was so different? Why had it affected her so deeply? It was just a meal, just a simple, tiny moment of indulgence, yet it felt like so much more. In the back of her mind, Solara knew she couldn't go back to her people and tell them about her experience. To do so would risk her reputation, and she had no desire to let anyone know that she had acted so carelessly. She was a princess. She was supposed to be above such indulgences, but no matter how much she tried to push the feeling aside, she couldn't. The next evening, Solara found herself drawn back to the market again. This time, she was more careful. She kept to the shadows, away from the busy crowds. She didn't want to be seen, didn't want to risk someone recognizing her. She only wanted to experience that feeling again, the feeling of connection and warmth that the food had given her. At the same food stall, the human vendor was there again. He was grilling something that smelled just as good as the first time. Solara's stomach rumbled, reminding her how much she wanted more. She hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, she approached him once more. The vendor saw her and smiled, as if he recognized her from the night before. "Back for more?" he asked, his voice friendly and warm. Solara hesitated but then nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "I would like to try more." The vendor chuckled softly. "You've got good taste. It's on the house this time," he said, handing her another skewer. Solara took it, feeling a strange sense of comfort from his kindness. The food was a small gift, but it felt like more than just a meal to her. As she took the first bite, she felt that same rush of excitement. The warmth, the spices, the combination of flavors, it was all there again. And this time, it seemed even more intense. The food was amazing, but what surprised Solara most was the feeling that came with it. It was as if the food wasn't just filling her stomach, but also something deeper inside her. It made her feel alive, as though she was experiencing life in a way that was completely new. She couldn't help but smile, her heart fluttering with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. She had thought that this would just be a fleeting moment, something she could forget once she returned to her royal duties. But now she wasn't so sure. The food was simple, yes, but it was also full of surprises, both in flavor and in the emotions it stirred in her. As she ate, Solara looked around at the humans who surrounded her. They weren't like her, rigid, controlled, and distant. They were open, full of life, and it was in their food, their laughter, and the way they shared everything with each other. It was something she couldn't quite put her finger on, but she knew it was something her own people didn't have. The Scifians had their strength and their power, but they lacked something important, something that made the humans different, and in Solara's mind, something that made them stronger. As she finished the last bite of food, she stood up, feeling more connected to the world around her than she ever had before. She had broken the rules, yes, but in doing so, she had learned something that could change everything. Maybe her people weren't as advanced as they thought. Maybe they had missed something essential by focusing only on power and control. Solara looked back at the vendor, who was busy preparing food for the next customer. She felt a strange sense of gratitude for him, for his kindness, for the food that had opened her eyes to a world she had never imagined. With one last glance at the market, Solara turned and made her way back to her quarters. But this time, something was different. The feeling inside her wasn't one of guilt or shame. It was excitement. A deep, unfamiliar excitement for what the future might hold. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to see the universe in a new way. The Scifians had always been focused on conquering and controlling, but Solara had tasted something more. She had tasted freedom, warmth, and connection. She had tasted humanity. And she knew, in that moment, that she couldn't go back to the way things had been. The days following Solara's secret feasts were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. The simple human food had unlocked something in her, something she hadn't even realized she was missing. The taste of spices, the richness of flavors, and the warmth that spread through her after each bite lingered in her mind long after she had returned to the cold, rigid world of the Scifian Empire. Her people were efficient, cold, and controlled, and the more Solara thought about it, the more she questioned everything she had been taught. Back on her ship, surrounded by the familiar metallic walls, Solara tried to push her newfound thoughts aside. She knew she had broken the rules by tasting human food, but it wasn't just the food that had affected her. It was the connection she had felt, the warmth, the laughter, the joy that had come with each shared meal. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. But could she really trust these feelings? As a princess of the Scifians, Solara was expected to be a leader, someone who upheld the values of her people. Order, power, and efficiency. Everything in her life had been dictated by these principles. The Scifian way of life was simple: follow the rules, maintain control, and never let anything or anyone get in the way of your mission. This was the way of the conquerors, and it had worked for centuries. Her people had thrived because they were strong, and their strength came from their ability to stay focused, to remain detached from emotions. But now, Solara was beginning to question that detachment. She had tasted something real, something emotional, and it made her wonder, what was the point of all the power and control if it meant sacrificing something as simple and pure as connection? Could she truly ignore the joy she had felt with the humans? Could she continue to live in a world that valued efficiency over everything else? Every time she tried to push the thoughts away, they crept back into her mind. She found herself thinking about the human woman who had shared the meal with her, the one who had treated her with such kindness and warmth. The way the woman had smiled, not just because of the food, but because of the simple act of sharing it with someone else. It had meant something. That was something Solara's people would never understand. She was torn between the life she had always known and the life she had tasted for the first time. The Scivians had no room for weakness or emotion. They had no time for things like food and laughter. Everything was about power, control, and survival. But was it worth it? Was it worth living in a world where everything was so cold and calculated? The more Solara thought about it, the more confused she became. She had spent her entire life preparing to lead her people, to conquer new worlds and strengthen the Scivian Empire. But now she wasn't sure she even believed in that mission anymore. The idea of leading a people who didn't understand the simple joy of sharing a meal, of laughing together, of living in the moment, it didn't sit right with her. How could she go back to her people, knowing what she had experienced with the humans? The weight of her thoughts became unbearable. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay focused, to think with clarity and precision. But now she found herself filled with doubt, something she had never allowed herself to feel before. How could she reconcile the two worlds, the cold, calculating world of the Scivians and the warm, emotional world of the humans? Solara's internal struggle continued for days, and she grew more distant from her duties. She would sit in her quarters, staring out into the vast expanse of space, wondering if there was a place where she could belong, where she could be more than just a princess in a cold empire. The weight of her responsibilities pressed heavily on her, and yet she felt a yearning for something she couldn't quite define. It was like a hunger, a desire to be part of something more than just power and control. One afternoon during a routine council meeting, Solara sat quietly at the head of the table, her mind drifting far from the discussions at hand. Her advisors were speaking of new conquests and military strategies, but she could barely focus on their words. The same thoughts kept returning to her: the food, the laughter, the feeling of connection. It had all started with a simple meal, yet it had opened a door to something deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Her advisor, Thelin, noticed her distant gaze and paused in his speech. "Princess Solara," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You seem distracted. Is something troubling you?" Solara snapped back to reality, startled by his voice. She forced a smile and quickly composed herself. "No, nothing at all," she replied, though her voice lacked the usual confidence. She glanced around the room, noticing the concerned expressions of her advisors. They were used to her being composed, confident, and in control. But now, they saw something different, something they couldn't quite place. Thelin raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. He resumed speaking, but Solara's mind remained elsewhere. She found it harder and harder to ignore the truth that was slowly dawning on her. The life she had been taught to lead, the life she had worked so hard to master, no longer felt right. It was as though she had stepped outside of herself, seen a world that was full of warmth and life. And now she couldn't unsee it. As the meeting continued, Solara's gaze drifted to the window. She looked out at the stars, her thoughts lost in the vastness of space. The weight of her doubt grew heavier, and for the first time, she felt a deep longing for something beyond her empire. Perhaps it was time to change her path, to seek out the very things that had brought her such unexpected joy. But the question remained: could she walk away from everything she had known, or was she destined to live in the cold, calculated world of the Scivians forever? Her heart ached with uncertainty, and she knew that the decisions she would make in the coming days would shape her future forever. Solara had tried to bury the growing unrest inside her, but every time she returned to her duties, her mind wandered back to the humans. She couldn't stop thinking about the simple meals they shared, the joy that filled their faces as they ate together. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't ignore the changes inside her. The idea of being a part of something different, something real, was becoming too strong to resist. One day, as she roamed the halls of the Scifian flagship, trying to shake off her thoughts, she was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. She turned to see one of her guards, a tall, stern figure named Iroh, approaching her. His face was grim, and Solara instantly knew something was wrong. "Princess," Iroh said, bowing slightly, "there is a visitor who wishes to speak with you." Solara raised an eyebrow. She didn't have many visitors. Her position as princess made her a figure of authority, and often isolation. "A visitor?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. "Who is it?" Iroh hesitated for a moment. "A human," he replied simply. The mention of a human surprised Solara. Humans were usually kept at a distance. Any interaction with her people was carefully controlled and measured. She had not expected anyone from Earth to approach her, especially not without an official reason. A human here, on the ship, was unusual. It was either a diplomatic representative or a mistake, but neither seemed likely. "Let them in," Solara said, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. A few moments later, the door to her quarters slid open, and Solara's eyes widened in surprise. Standing before her was the same human woman who had shared food with her in the market. She was wearing a simple but elegant dress, her hair cascading in soft waves around her shoulders. The woman's eyes locked onto Solara's, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The human smiled softly, almost as if she had been expecting to see Solara again. "Your Highness," she said, her voice warm and friendly, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Solara stood frozen for a moment. She had never expected to see this woman again, especially not like this. The sudden appearance of someone so familiar, yet so different, left her speechless. She quickly composed herself, stepping forward. "No, you're not disturbing me," Solara replied, gesturing for the woman to enter. "Please, come in." The woman stepped inside, looking around at the sterile, metallic surroundings of the Scifian ship. She seemed unfazed by the starkness, her expression calm and curious. She glanced at Solara, who was still processing the situation. "I did not expect to see you here," Solara said. "You? How did you find me?" The human woman chuckled softly. "I've learned a few things since we last met," she said. "I could feel your curiosity, Princess. The way you looked at the food and the people. I knew you weren't like the others." Solara's heart skipped a beat. The woman's words were unexpectedly perceptive. It was true. Solara had always felt different from the rest of her people. She had never fully embraced the Scifian way, but she hadn't expected anyone to notice. Her curiosity, her questioning of everything she had been taught, had been a silent part of her until now. "I was curious," Solara admitted, her voice soft. "Curious about your food, about your people." The human smiled, nodding. "I thought so. I felt your hesitation when you took that first bite of the food. You were experiencing something you'd never known before." She paused, then added, "You seemed surprised." Solara looked at her in surprise. "You noticed?" "Of course," the woman replied. "Food isn't just about taste. It's about experience. It's about connection." She stepped closer to Solara, lowering her voice. "You wanted to experience more, didn't you?" Solara's breath caught in her throat. She had always believed that her curiosity was something she had to keep hidden, something that would be seen as a weakness by her people. But this human woman, standing in front of her, seemed to understand. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. "Why are you here?" Solara asked, her voice quieter now. The woman hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak her true intentions. "I came to offer you something," she said finally. "An opportunity. You've tasted something you never expected, something that made you question your beliefs. But that's only the beginning, Princess. You don't have to live in a world that only values power. You can be part of something more." Solara felt her heart race as the woman's words sank in. Could it be true? Could there really be a way to live outside the cold, detached world of her people? To live in a way that valued connection, warmth, and the simple joys that humans embraced? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "What do you mean?" Solara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The human woman smiled gently. "I know you feel it too. The need for something more. You've tasted human food, but you've also felt the connection that comes with it. It's not just about the food, Princess. It's about living fully. It's about embracing emotions and bonds, not suppressing them. And it's not just something for humans. It can be something for you too." Solara felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Her entire life had been about control, about keeping her emotions in check. She had been trained to see her people as superior, to believe that their way of life was the only way. But now, standing in front of this woman, she felt a pull in her chest, a desire to break free from everything she had ever known. "I don't know if I can just leave everything behind," Solara admitted, her voice tinged with doubt. "I have responsibilities, a duty to my people." The woman nodded, her expression understanding. "I don't expect you to abandon everything. But maybe you can begin to see the world differently. You can still lead your people, but you can lead them with empathy, with understanding. You can show them that strength doesn't come from control. It comes from connection." Solara looked down, her mind racing. Could she really do this? Could she live in a way that was so different from everything she had known? Could she change not just herself, but the very way her people saw the world? For the first time, she wasn't sure what her future held. But standing before this human woman, Solara knew one thing for certain. She couldn't go back to the way things were. Something inside her had changed, and there was no turning back now. The days after the human woman's visit were filled with turmoil for Solara. She couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. The words she had spoken to Solara lingered, echoing in her thoughts. Strength doesn't come from control. It comes from connection. The idea was so foreign to Solara, yet it resonated deeply within her, creating a whirlwind of emotions she hadn't expected. Solara stood on the bridge of her ship, gazing out into the vast emptiness of space. The stars were distant and cold, much like the life she had always known. Yet, for the first time in years, she wasn't sure where she belonged. She had always known her duty: lead the Scivians to conquer new worlds, uphold their traditions, and follow the path that had been laid out for her. But now, a small seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing steadily inside her. The human woman's words kept playing in her mind. Could she really change everything? Could she still fulfill her responsibilities as a princess, as a leader, while embracing something as chaotic and emotional as connection? The more she thought about it, the more it seemed impossible. The Scivians had always thrived because of their discipline, their rigid structure. Emotions were a weakness, and their society had been built around the idea that feelings could cloud judgment. But Solara had felt something different during her brief moments with the humans. The warmth of the food, the laughter, the way they shared simple moments together. It was unlike anything she had ever known. The Scivians didn't understand these things, and perhaps that was what made them so disconnected from the true essence of life. Could she really bring these values into her own world? Could she challenge everything she had been taught? Solara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching her. She turned to see Iroh, one of her trusted advisors, walking towards her. His serious expression told her that something important was about to happen. He had always been a loyal servant to the Scivian Empire, and his presence reminded her of the responsibility that weighed heavily on her shoulders. "Princess," Iroh said, bowing slightly as he approached, "the council requests your presence. There is a matter that needs your attention." Solara nodded, still lost in her thoughts. "I'll be there shortly," she replied, her voice distant. As Iroh turned to leave, he paused and glanced back at her. "You seem troubled, Princess," he remarked, his tone softer than usual. "Is something wrong?" Solara hesitated. For a moment, she considered telling him about her doubts, about the feelings she had been struggling with, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. It was too risky, too dangerous to reveal her inner conflict. She was the princess, the future leader of the Silivian people. She couldn't afford to show weakness. "I'm fine," Solara said, her voice returning to its usual calm. "I'll be there soon." With a final nod, Iroh left the room, and Solara was left alone with her thoughts. She stared out at the stars once more, feeling the weight of the decision that loomed over her. She knew she had to go to the council meeting, but a part of her wanted to run, to escape from the expectations, from the rigid life that had been set for her. She wanted to find something more, something that made her feel alive, something that wasn't controlled by duty and tradition. Solara took a deep breath, didn't ignore the empire she was destined to lead. When she arrived at the council room, the atmosphere was tense. The high-ranking members of the Silivian Empire stood around a large table, their expressions grim. At the center of the room stood the elder counselor, an imposing figure named Xara. She was the voice of tradition, the embodiment of everything the Silivians held dear: discipline, order, and control. "Princess Solara," Xara said as Solara entered the room, "we have received disturbing reports from the human colony. There has been an incident involving one of your personal attendants. They have been caught interacting with the humans in an unauthorized manner." Solara's heart skipped a beat. She had always been careful to avoid such situations, and yet here she was, being confronted with an issue that could jeopardize everything. Her personal attendants had been trained to serve her with the utmost loyalty, but it seemed one of them had strayed from the path. The council's reaction would be swift and unforgiving. "Explain yourself, Princess," Xara continued, her tone cold and accusatory. "This behavior is unacceptable. We cannot allow the influence of the humans to spread within our ranks. Their customs are primitive, and any interaction with them is a threat to the integrity of our empire." Solara's mind raced. She knew she couldn't defend the actions of her attendant, but she couldn't sit there and ignore the truth either. The Silivians were so focused on control, on power, that they had never considered what it might mean to open themselves up to others. The way the humans lived, free, connected, and full of emotion, was something her people had never experienced. "I understand the concern," Solara began, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "But I also believe that we are missing something important. The humans have something we don't. They live with a sense of connection, of unity that we have lost. I believe we could learn from them." The room fell silent. The council members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from disbelief to disdain. Xara, however, regarded Solara with a hard, unwavering gaze. "You are speaking of weakness, Princess," Xara said. "Do you suggest that we abandon our strength, our discipline, in favor of feelings?" Solara met Sarah's gaze, her own expression unyielding. "I'm not suggesting we abandon our strength, but we must understand that there is more to life than just power and control. The humans know something we don't. We need to open our minds to that possibility." Xara's lips tightened into a thin line. "I see. You have been influenced by their primitive ways." "I have been influenced by the truth," Solara replied firmly, "and I cannot ignore it any longer." The council room erupted into murmurs, the members unsure how to respond to Solara's words. The tension in the air was thick, but Solara stood tall, knowing that this was the moment she had been preparing for. She had made her decision. There was no turning back now. She would challenge everything she had been taught, even if it meant facing the consequences. "I am not just a princess of power," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "I am a leader, and I will lead with compassion, with understanding. We cannot continue to live in the cold, distant world we have created. It is time for change. The council members exchanged uncertain looks, but one thing was clear. Solara's words had struck a chord. Whether they agreed or not, they knew something had shifted within her, and that shift would change everything. The council meeting had ended in silence, leaving a heavy weight in the air. Solara stood in the center of the room, her heart pounding with the realization that her words had set something in motion, something that could not be undone. She had spoken out, defied the very foundation of her people's way of life, and now she had to live with the consequences. As she walked through the long, empty corridors of the Scifian flagship, Solara's mind raced. She had always been the princess, trained to lead, to uphold the ideals of strength and discipline that her people valued so highly. But now, those ideals felt like chains, holding her back from something more. Something real. The human woman's words echoed in her mind. Strength doesn't come from control. It comes from connection. For the first time, Solara truly understood what they meant. The thoughts of her duty to her people, to her empire, now seemed so distant. Could she really lead the Scifians in the way they had always known? Could she continue to rule a people so focused on power, efficiency, and control while living in a way that embraced warmth, connection, and emotions? The questions gnawed at her as she walked aimlessly through the ship. Solara had always prided herself on her ability to make clear, decisive choices, but now she found herself torn. Her heart longed for something different, but her mind reminded her of the empire she was destined to lead. Could she balance both? Could she embrace the values of the humans and still fulfill her role as princess of the Scifian Empire? She had never felt so uncertain. That evening, as Solara stood at the edge of the observation deck, gazing out at the stars, she was joined by Iroh. His quiet footsteps approached her, and she didn't turn to greet him. She didn't need to. She could sense his presence, steady and calm, as always. He had been her most trusted advisor for years, and though she had often relied on his wisdom, she knew that this time, the decision was hers to make. "You've changed, princess," Iroh said softly, his voice steady as always. He stood beside her, his eyes also fixed on the stars beyond the window. Solara sighed, not knowing how to respond. It was true. She had changed. The questions that had once been buried deep inside her had now risen to the surface. And now it felt like they could not be ignored. "I don't know what I'm doing, Iroh," she confessed, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I don't know if I can continue living the way I have, leading the way I have." Iroh said nothing at first, but Solara could feel his gaze on her. Finally, he spoke. "You are the princess of the Scifian Empire, Solara. You were raised to lead, to guide our people to strength and glory. But it is also true that you are human, just like those you've met. You have the same emotions, the same needs. Those things do not make you weak. They make you real." Solara looked up at him, surprised by the softness in his words. She had always seen Iroh as a pillar of strength, a man who had never allowed his emotions to cloud his judgment. Yet now, she was hearing something different in his voice. There was a hint of understanding, even acceptance. It was as if he, too, had come to see the truth in what she was feeling. "But how can I be both?" she asked. "How can I lead my people, fulfill my duty, and still allow myself to feel?" Iroh's response was gentle but firm. "You do not need to choose between your duty and your heart. They can coexist. In fact, they must. A true leader does not only command with power, but with compassion. That is what the humans understand, and perhaps it is time we learned from them." Solara felt a wave of relief wash over her at his words. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For so long, she had felt trapped between two worlds, her duty to her people and the growing desire for something more, something deeper. She had thought she would have to choose one over the other, but Iroh had shown her that it was possible to embrace both. "I'm not sure if the council will accept this," she murmured, her gaze once again turning to the stars. They have always been focused on control, on conquering, on strength. They will not understand what I'm trying to do. They do not need to understand, Iroh said, his voice calm. You do not need to explain yourself to anyone. If you lead with your heart, with a true understanding of what it means to care for others, they will follow. It may take time, but in the end, that is the kind of leader they will respect. Solara felt the stirrings of hope deep inside her. Could it really be that simple? Could she truly lead with compassion and still fulfill her role as princess? It seemed almost impossible, yet Iroh's words made her feel that it was possible, even if the road ahead would be difficult. I think I'm ready, Solara said quietly, her voice filled with determination. I'm ready to find a new way to lead. I'm ready to take a path that isn't defined by power, but by connection. Iroh gave a small nod, his expression softening. Then you are ready to be the leader your people need, princess. Solara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle within her. This was not an easy choice, and it would not be without its challenges. The Silivians would not easily accept change, especially not from their princess. But she knew, deep down, that this was the only way forward. She could no longer live in a world that only valued power and control. She needed to live in a world that embraced connection, emotion, and the beauty of shared experiences. The next day, Solara called for another council meeting. This time, she was ready to face the consequences of her decision. She knew that her path would not be easy, but it was the path she had chosen. And as she stood before the council, ready to speak her truth, she felt a new strength within her, a strength that came not from control, but from her heart. I am not the same as I was before, she began, her voice steady and clear. And I will not lead this empire in the same way. I will lead with compassion, with understanding. I will lead with the belief that strength comes from connection, from unity, from the simple joys that we have long ignored. The council members watched her in silence, their faces unreadable. But Solara stood tall, unafraid, ready to begin a new chapter, one where her heart and her duty would finally align. The room was filled with a heavy silence as Solara stood before the council. The members of the Silivian leadership were not accustomed to change, especially not the kind of change she was proposing. For centuries, the Silivians had thrived through power, control, and absolute discipline. To suggest a shift in their ways, to embrace something as fragile and unpredictable as human connection, was almost unthinkable. But Solara was resolute. She had made her decision, and now there was no turning back. She had to face the council, to stand in front of them, and declare that the future of the Silivian Empire would be different. It would be one where strength was not defined by dominance, but by the ability to connect, to feel, to understand, and to care. I have called you here today, Solara began, her voice steady, because I believe the time has come for our empire to change. We have always prided ourselves on our strength and our ability to control every aspect of our lives. But we have forgotten something vital. We have forgotten the power of connection. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, their faces filled with disbelief. They had never heard the princess speak like this before. Solara could feel the weight of their skepticism, but she refused to back down. She had seen the way the humans lived, the way they shared meals, laughter, and moments of joy. It was something her people had never allowed themselves to experience, and now she knew it was something they needed. We have lived for too long in the shadow of our own pride, Solara continued. We believe that strength comes from control, that to rule is to dominate. But in doing so, we have ignored the one thing that makes us truly strong, our ability to connect with one another. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the council remained silent. Solara could feel the tension in the room, the disbelief, the resistance. But she stood her ground, her eyes unwavering. She knew this would not be easy, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. We are not just conquerors, she said, her voice growing stronger. We are a people. And as a people, we must learn to embrace each other, not as tools to be used or enemies to be defeated, but as beings with hearts and souls. We must learn to value kindness, empathy, and compassion. One of the council members, an elder named Varric, stood up. His face was stern, and his voice carried the weight of authority. "Princess, you speak of things that have no place in our world. Our empire has been built on strength, on the unwavering belief that power is the only path to survival. To suggest that we abandon this for the sake of feelings is dangerous." Celara met his gaze, unflinching. "It is not an abandonment, Varric. It is an evolution. We can still be strong, but we must learn to be strong together. We cannot continue to live in isolation, believing that power alone is enough. The humans have something we have lost, and if we do not change, we risk losing everything." There was a murmur among the council members. Some seemed uneasy, others looked uncertain, but Celara could see the flicker of thought in their eyes. They were not immune to the truth in her words. They, too, had felt the distance between themselves and the humans, between their people and the world they ruled. Celara could see it now. They were not completely closed off to change, but they were afraid of what it would mean for them, for their power, and for their way of life. But Celara knew that fear was the first thing they had to overcome. Fear of losing control, fear of embracing vulnerability, fear of being more than just conquerors. She had faced her own fears, and now it was time for them to face theirs. "I know this is difficult," Celara said, her voice softening. "But if we do not adapt, if we do not change, we risk losing our humanity. And what is power if we have no connection, no compassion? What is strength if it is built on the suffering of others?" There was a long pause, and Celara could feel the eyes of the council members on her. She knew this was a turning point, a moment that would define her reign and the future of the Scifian Empire. She had taken the first step towards something new, something unknown, and she could only hope that the council would follow. Finally, Varric spoke again, his voice quieter now. "You ask for a change that we have never considered. But perhaps you are right. Perhaps we have become too focused on the wrong kind of strength. If we are to survive in this universe, we must learn to adapt, to grow, to connect." Celara's heart skipped a beat. She had not expected this. The words she had longed to hear had finally come from one of her people. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Perhaps," Varric continued, "it is time for a new kind of leadership, one that values compassion as much as strength." The room fell silent once more. Celara looked around at the faces of the council members. They were no longer resistant, but thoughtful. They were listening, and that was the first step. They were beginning to understand that change was not weakness, but a necessary part of survival. Celara took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. She had opened the door, and now it was up to them to walk through it. "I do not expect you to change overnight," she said, her voice calm. "But I ask that you consider a new way forward, a way that embraces both our strength and our humanity." The council members nodded slowly, and Celara knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. The Scifian Empire had always been about power, but now it was time for something different. It was time for connection, for empathy, for compassion. And perhaps, just perhaps, that would be the strength that would carry them into a new era. As the meeting came to an end, Celara stepped out into the corridor, her mind buzzing with the possibilities. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be resistance and challenges, but she was ready. For the first time, she felt certain that she was on the right path, the path that would lead the Scifians not just to power, but to something far greater, something that could unite them with the rest of the universe.